Hello everyone, welcome to our fifth video lecture, and for this session we'll talk about genre and genre structures. So we will begin by defining and describing the nature of genre or genres. How is it different from the other dimensions of discourse and styles? And then we're also going to talk about how arguments, ideologies, and narratives characterize genre. And then we will also discuss about genre analysis, the different steps that we can take so that we can perform a genre analysis, particularly when we want to examine emerging genres. So the sources for this are Chapter 4 of Paltridge book and also Chapter 4 of Fairclough's 2003 book. So we have touched on this on previous lessons before, but what are genres? So genres are patterns, right? So they are socially organized ways of using language to achieve specific goals. Genres are not just forms, but also social actions articulated in discoursal ways. They are how we get things done in society. And so genre has recognizable patterns. Like, for example, a business letter would have a heading, a greeting, a body, a closing, and a signature at the beginning, which allows both the writer and the reader to know na, this is a letter and there's a particular purpose for doing this. And we have learned about this when we were in our earlier English and Filipino classes. Also, genres exist in a particular social context. For example, the genre of a lecture takes place in a classroom, or a news report is published in print or broadcast media. And for example, a court summary or summation happens in a court, in a judicial court. Also, genres have a dynamic nature, so they're not fixed. They evolve with technology. Like, for example, the memos that we usually make or the handwritten letters are now emails, and while we still follow the heading, greeting, body, closing genre, the way we articulate them is quite different. And probably now when we communicate with someone from emails, now we use quick messengers, like, for example, Messenger, Slack, WhatsApp, etc. And also culture. For example, a more progressive, ethics-siding brand would usually articulate their ways less formally, as opposed to, let's say, more traditional, long-standing institutions or organizations. And also, texts are classified into genres based on similarity, or what Paltridge calls prototypicality. Right? So rather than strict rules, like what do you usually see? Like, for example, a book review can inform, evaluate, and persuade at the same time, but they are all still part of the genre, even though the texts within them do different things. So Paltridge articulates or borrows text from various theoreticians, in terms of language, right? So, for example, Martin in 1984 argues that genres are stage goal-oriented social activities, and these are actually, as we have articulated, texts are social events, and these are the actions that drive those events. So they are about doing things with language. So genres are about doing things with language. And on the other hand, Swales focus on the communicative purpose as the key to deciding if a text belongs to a genre, but later acknowledge that genres can have multiple purposes. Like, for example, a particular brand can mix and match different micro-genres. We'll talk about that later. And as Miller has noted, genres are social actions wherein shared agreements on how to act with language, right? Particularly in the critical part of CDA, we also interrogate how genre is a way that people use language to act and interact in social lives. So, in short, these are actions that are not just actions because they have goals, but they have antecedents and they also have consequences. They are the discoursal side of social action, as I mentioned, meaning they are not just about what we say, but about what we do when we say it, right? So, when we look at the genre dimension of discourse analysis, these are the main questions that we ask. One, what is the type of social action is this text performing? Is this informing? Is this persuading? Is it debating? Is it justifying, arguing? Is it promoting? Is it establishing a relationship, right? Is it telling you something new? And etc. And then we also ask, how does it contribute to a chain of actions and interactions to society? Like, for example, this business letter, how does it interact with other relationalities, no, in a particular organization? What is the particular action set does a business letter do in order to keep the organization flow moving? Like, for example, for me, if I want to apply for a financial request from the university for me to spend particular budget for a certain initiative that I want to do, I have to make a business letter or fill out a form, right? So that I can get that permission. And then it is responded to by another genre, probably an email from the provost or an email from the dean that approves or disapproves or directs me to change my request. So the business letter is a part of those chains of social actions that sort of keep society moving. And of course, different levels of social systems will have a different way of placing a particular genre into the sea or the landscape or the web of entangled genres that keep this particular organization, institution, interaction going. And of course, more importantly, how is it connected to social structures and how can we make use of genre to transform society, to forward social change, right? So for example, when we in terms of the way we have changed the genre of approving business letters or request letters in the university from wet signature to a digital approval via email, then we can see a lot of social structures happening there. Like, for example, centering technology, right? Efficiency, probably the social structures of moving towards sustainability, decreasing wastes, etc. Then that could probably be the particular social ideology that it's also being followed, right? So, of course, this all sounds good. But for example, when we talk about like using letters for us to be able to point out, let's say, the issue of a particular particular policy that we want to critique, right? And how sometimes business letters are used as sort of dampening down the anger or the frustration. So you use the business letter or you use letters. You go to the mayor and you write a letter signifying your discontent of a particular program or project, right? And you note that we can note that this particular genre sort of excludes people who may not be able to have a good grasp, of really being able to write a compelling letter. So, because you just imagine, if you want to, if you are from the relatively poorer and low literacy sector of your community, and you are trying to advocate for yourself for a particular service, and based on established rules and mechanisms in governance, you have to write a letter, a formal letter, telling your barangay captain or your LGU chief executive that these are the things that we want to happen. If you don't have the talent or the intellectual capacity for you to be able to actually perform or make a business letter, then that kind of excludes you for that possibility to make yourself more agentic, to advocate for yourself. And sometimes, when one of the things that we teach, for when we do community development is to write business letters, because that is a particular genre that where you can articulate your grievances in a quote unquote acceptable, quote unquote governance compliant way, right? And so that's the way we can sort of use also genres for social change, right? But of course, we also study about more disruptive genre, like for example the freedom wall as a genre, right? Can you just imagine about how effective that is? Or for example, how the genre of, let's say, an evaluation of a teacher in the formal evaluation scheme versus profs to pick. What would be the difference between those genres, and what are the difference in terms of the styles that they use, the persuasive techniques that they use, and how is it tied to larger structures? Why do these genres exist in the first place when you already have a genre wherein you can write qualitative evaluation through your teachers? Why do you need a separate genre of profs to pick? So what particular social structure, ideology, constraints are we trying to address there? Maybe that's something that you can also look into in terms of the research that you want to do for this class. And also, as I mentioned, the genres are, do not operate in singularity. They are part of networks and they are part of genre chains. So for example, you want to apply for a job, but it's really not just, this whole story of a job application is not just one genre. No, it's a chain of interrelated genres. Like, for example, you are able to read a job advertisement, either that's in LinkedIn or on a paper, then you make a resume or a curriculum vitae, and that curriculum vitae has to have a cover letter, and that, of course, has, eventually if you get called on for an interview is another genre. And then when you, of course, when things go, in your favor, you have another genre of the whole job offer thing, and then a negotiation that comes with it, and then a contract signing. So each stage is dependent and it shapes the next. They're all correlated, but they're also distinct. I would argue that an interview would be different when it's already your interface for a job offer, because like the social actions are different. Like, for example, as for an interviewee and an interviewer, the power is more in the vertical sense, in the one interviewing, and the interviewee is the one sort of impressing, putting forth their best foot forward, right? But in a negotiation table, in a job offer table, medyo nagkuha na ng kaunting power itong si interviewee, right? The job prospect now has a little bit more power because you know that you are considered as someone desirable for the job. So you kind of already sort of harness the power. And so the way, the language that you use in order to interact with the person you're talking to, whether that's your prospective manager or whether that's the HR, has already differentiated as opposed to when you were still in your initial interview phase. And just like we have a linguistic repertoire, we also have a repertoire of genres. Like, we also draw from multiple genres to accomplish a task. And this is probably something that you do, for example, in when you decide on, let's say, your final paper in class is any creative output that would summarize your insights and reflections about this class. And you have now a repertoire of genre of how you'll be able to do that, quote-unquote, creative work. So it can be an infographic, a video, a meme, a presentation, or a role play, or a song, or a poetry, right, or a poem, right? So again, we also navigate the repertoire of genre, but also the repertoire of genre differs from one person to the next, within one context to the next. I would argue that in terms of, let's say, in terms of emailing and quick messaging, I would say that, like, for example, millennials and Gen Zers have that in the bag. But, like, for example, handling landline calls, like, because of the technological exposure that millennials and let's say Gen Xers have, they are able to, feel more comfortable engaging in a landline conversation, as opposed, let's say, to a Gen Zer, particularly because they don't have technological exposure, no? Particularly Gen Alpha as well, because, sa mundo na yan, wala na masyadong landline use, no? Yeah. And also, genres differ across cultures, like how genres look, sound, feel, can differ by culture. For example, academic writing in Japan or China may have different structures compared to English essays. But of course, we must also avoid stereotyping, because there's also variety within each culture as well. And like, for example, the creation of memes, right? So there are memes that we couldn't really say that memes are universal, because the way we appreciate memes that come from the West would be different from the memes that come from the East, and in the Philippines particular, and I've seen this, like, so fascinatingly, when we talk to when we when I watch Slasian Royale in Drag Race, and how humor as making jokes as a genre is so different from those who from the drag queens coming from the Philippines, and from the drag queens coming from different parts of the world, where there's a Drag Race franchise and they're put together, and how the jokes are different, how humor is taken differently, right? But again, we do not want to stereotype, because again, within the Philippines, I would argue that the Bisaya, the Ilonggos, the Mindanaoans would have a different, take on jokes, or take on what they conceive as a formal conversation over not formal conversation. And as I mentioned earlier, so single text can mix multiple genres, right? So you can, for example, an advertisement, could engage, could show a narrative. I think one of the best examples here is MX3, right? So they begin with an intertextuality of a scripture from the Bible, right? They begin with that, right? And then after saying that, they call on a particular person. Sundan natin ang storya ni Maria, isang cashier na 40 years old, and then magsasalita siya, di ba? Dahil sa MX3, nawala ang sakit sa kasukasuhan ko. Because of MX3, my arthritic pain had died down, etc. And then there's MX3, the promotional part, and then the desire and the action part, right? And so that is an example of that's a single radio ad script, but it puts a lot of things, like you have a biblical sermon in the beginning, you have an introduction, and then you have a narration from a person who had used MX3, and then you go back to the narrator, to the promoter, right? So that's an example of how one particular genre of quote-unquote radio script puts together a lot of genres within it. So genres can also be global or local. So global are, genres that is understood across societies. Like, for example, a business letter, right? Or an email. But there are also genres that are only found in a particular culture. Like, for example, TikTok scripts. No? So if you're outside TikTok, you wouldn't know what that is, right? So for those countries with no TikTok access, then they won't be able to know that. So another example of a genre network or a genre chain would be like, for example, content creation. Like your genre repertoires include IG stories, TikTok duets, you have memes, you have Discord threads, and they are often mixed into one campaign. Like for example, it's a fundraising drive that starts with TikTok and then it continues with a G crush code, right? QR code story, and then it ends with a live stream, or probably begins with a live stream, and then that live stream i-edit yung live stream na yon, and then it becomes now a reel in IG or a TikTok post, and then after that you have a Gcash post or a story, right, for a fundraising. So that's an example of a more current example of genre chains. And linked to what I have noted earlier is that there has been an emergence of digital genres. I think when Fairclough was writing their work in 2003, maybe they have not really fully imagined that the saturation of different digital platforms that we have now, and within this particular platform you have different genres, and then within those genres you have your subgenres. Like for example, you have like a platform on, let's say, Instagram, and then within Instagram you have particular ways of doing social action there. Now you have text as or scripts as part of a story. It can be a particular post, it can be a reel, right? So, and then you also have the genre of like a status, yung bubble there's a bubble chat on top of your head. There's a dialogue chat where you can also post what you're thinking. So this is like, there's a lot of the genres now, but within this genre, like for example the genre of a reel, this can be like get ready with me. It's its own, right? Because there is a cadence to it. There is a script to a get ready with me script. There's some form of like structure that you expect with a get ready, or whether it's a dance challenge or a prank, right? So there are like what we expect, and like we are consuming different emerging genres, no? Almost monthly there's a new challenge out there, and this challenge again has its own scripts, it has its own structures, no? It reveals something about society, it reveals something about what's inside you, etc. And we also have to understand that genres do not come from nowhere, they evolve, right? All genres have antecedents. For example, tweets, that as we know now, they follow from the brevity of short messaging systems, the texts that we used to have in abundance in the early 2000s, and and then also headline writing in news, but eventually they became unique because they have hashtags, which again is borrowed by other genres. They have threads now, and they have the virality culture, and now there is, you can also show your status with the genre that you're using, whether you are limited to a 200 word plus, or you can have a full on if you are verified by Elon Musk. So again, these genres, they evolve over time. They borrow and innovate from other genres, etc. And so when we talk about digital emergence of new genres, we talk about it from the context of what people do with technology rather than the technology itself. Like, you have so many apps that tried to, mainstream themselves, right? So for example, you have Blue Sky, for example, or Mastodon, for example. But even if you have these new platforms, they don't necessarily get to create their new genre, because there was no social practice that was institutionalized with them, right? So for example, and also some genres sort of fizzle, right? So for example, the genre of like romance novels, I don't know if you've ever, in your life have seen this small 100-page pocket books, and you have a female sounding name in the beginning, like Andrea Coronel, and then the titles are very teleserie-ish, and then you have like a painting, a hand drawn, of a woman and a man, and and there also is a my cousin used to write for those romance novels, right? And she said that you cannot write a tragedy because that's not what they came here. There is a particular formulas, they would say, for you to write them. So that's used to be the genre, and then of course there is a social practice that has evolved from that. Like for example, you go to Recto, and when you're done reading your 35-50 pesos, you exchange it in Recto for a different one, because for example, Precious Hearts romances, they would produce like, I don't know, like 40, like 10 titles a week, right? And so of course you don't, during the time 40 pesos, 50 pesos for a book is quite expensive already. So instead of like buying a book, you buy one and then you go to Recto, and then you exchange your book for a fee for another book that particular sort of library has. So that's sort of the genre of like Filipino Taglish, like rom-com novels, no? But in the advent of Wattpad, that sort of died because writing fiction now has become democratized. And also the genre in terms of like the stylistics, the intellectual heft, of the stories also kind of fizzled as well. When it came to this Wattpad, there is now a social component to it. You get to also asynchronously interact with the author. So, but after Wattpad, there are other ways, to other apps that are similar to Wattpad. I don't know how popular Wattpad still is now, or how salient it is, but it's not because Wattpad is there as a technology, but it's because of the social practices that has been born out of Wattpad, right? That sort of made the pocketbook, the printed pocketbook, fizzle out. One, you can be an author. Anyone can be an author. The editorial curation is not very strong, if it's any editorial curation at all, right? So that's not very strong. And so for people who are coming into this performance culture, right, it becomes easier for them. And so it's not really because of the Wattpad, but it's because of the practices that it affords people to do. You can write and at the same time be a reader, and that the one that you're reading also reads you, right? Sometimes you collaborate, sometimes you talk to each other. I don't have a Wattpad story. I just know that these things happen, no? So you can comment, diba? That's not something that you can do on a printed, right? You can comment on a particular line that sort of struck you. Oh my God, nakakakilig tong particular part na to. You can't do that, and have a social relationship with other readers and with the author, in a printed manner. And that's why for a time Wattpad became quite a thing, right? And also it becomes handy because you can, cell phone as well, it's integrated in, a long traffic. Basa ka ng Wattpad, you don't have to buy books, you can just have your cell phone, you can make basa ng Wattpad mo, and then you're good to go for a 2-hour traffic, right? So again, when we think about genres, sometimes from a sociological perspective, we always say, yes, because technologically determinist. yes, sure. I mean, the practices won't happen anyway if the technology isn't there. But, the technology can really foster the creation of a genre, the evolution of a genre, if it's able to mainstream a new discursive practice. And so, Paltridge also introduces the idea of meta-discourse within genres. You have interactive resources and interactional resources. So, for example, of interactive resources are those that guide readers, or transitions. Like, for example, in this section of the paper, we will be discussing the research design, the method, etc. So, it tells you now, okay, so this is what you expect in Maja. So parang it's meta discourse. It sort of tells you what the genre is going to be. So it's yun nga, no? So this is very common in writing thesis or research, right? This chapter 3 presents our results and discussions, etc., etc. Right? Comparing it with literature, so. And then you present whatever you need to present. So that's an interactive resource. No, it tells the reader that this is what this particular section is going to do. An interactional resource involves readers to show a particular stance, like you have hedges or boosters or engagement markers. Again, for example, this study underscores, or this study likely, or for example, the estimates produced from the computations suggests, demonstrates. So these are examples of telling the reader that that I am telling you that this is how you should interpret it. It's not conclusive, it's not super conclusive, it's only suggestive, it's only something that you cannot really generalize, right? So it kind of helps the reader sort of understand how to. So the first one is it tells the reader what to expect from the structure and the narratives of what they're going to read. The second one is sort of helps them how to make sense of what they read, right? So for example, these are the values, but you have to interpret them cautiously. When you extrapolate the data, you have to take note of these limitations, that this can or this likely means. You cannot, so I'm telling you that you shouldn't take everything, in face value. So parang sinasabihan mo na yung reader mo. You kind of help readers sort of digest already, as opposed to like a fiction, right? You don't have to, fiction doesn't work if you tell them like every single detail that they have to think about. You can use metaphors and everything, and you allow the reader to be more subjectively immersed and relate to the text in their own way. But like in academic writing, you will tell them that this is how you should interpret it. These are the hedges. These are the constraints of these findings. You have to just read it based on that. Okay, so that's the difference, no? Those are meta discourses. These are genres within genres that tell you what the genre is about and how you should interpret the text in that particular genre. Now, in Fairclough's parlance, right, we have introduced this in earlier sessions about action, representation, and being, right? And these three dimensions are the genres, the discourses, and the style. So we are now in the first dimension, the genres, and it's the ways of acting. And it's the express on the actional meanings of the text, as I mentioned earlier. So what the text is doing socially, like whether it's persuading, reporting, instructing, judging, etc. So how is it different from the other dimensions that we will be discussing in future sessions? So discourses, on the other hand, is the way of representing what meanings is expressed, what representational meanings, how the world or the social world or the phenomenon is portrayed. Like, does this particular text represent it as, for example, globalization is represented as progress, or is it represented as exploitation? This is based on the images, the metaphors, the word use in order, the semantic choices, right? To tell us that this is what we view the world or the phenomenon that we're trying to discussed in a particular text, right? And then styles is the way of being. How do we identify, how does the speaker identify themselves, and how do they identify the readers based on the text? So whether it represents identity, authority, or stance. Like, for example, in the case of business letters, it kind of tells you that the style is whether it can already tell you whether you are the one requesting. So it already positions you as someone who has a lower hierarchy than the one you're writing to. If it's a memo that you're putting down to your employee, it also tells you the hierarchy between you. No, and then of course, across different genres, the way these identities and styles are constructed are different, and we'll talk about them a little. We talked about them a little bit, no, in the previous sessions, and we'll talk about them, in detail towards the latter part of this course. Fairclough also calls upon other theories in terms of understanding the effects of genres. Like, for example, Giddens describes globalization in terms of how it's able to disembed, genre. So, for example, genres can be lifted or disembedded from their original context, like, for example, corporate advertising, and transplanted elsewhere, like cities marketing themselves globally or schools marketing themselves globally, as opposed to just, you having a multi-country. So means that it can be passed on, from one context to the next. Also, in the wise words of Habermas, who documented or argued the typologies of communicative and strategic action. So it argues that some genres aim at genuine dialogue, which is communicative, and others at achieving results, like strategic. Like, for example, it can sound communicative, but in the or dialogic, right? But it's persuasive. Like, for example, gusto mo bang manatili na madilim ang iyong kinabukasan? So, it sounds dialogic, but there is a persuasion, there's a strategy there. No, particularly in the context of a political campaign. Sawa ka na ba sa corrupt? Something like that, right? But you're persuading the person. That's a question, seemingly opening a dialogue, but the strategy is for you to eventually vote for the person who's going to be promoted in the particular political act, right? So that's an example of communicative and strategic action. And then Ms. Tal in 2000 also forwarded the idea of societal informalization, wherein public discourse has become more chatty and informal. And this is just in the 2000s. So we've seen how public discourse is getting more and more informalized, even to a point of being pedestrian, right? In terms of the way they are being done, as opposed to I'm not saying that being pedestrian is bad, but as opposed to the traditional standards of crafted words, pure English, diplomatic stances. Now you have, the more aggressive, the better. If you use inflammatory words, it's still part of public discourse, no? And we've seen how that had an effect on our culture, an effect on our policies, an effect on the integrity of social institutions, not only in our country, but also, in countries like the United States, of how, the informalization of discourse, the use of inflammatory language in political public discourse, had become mainstream and sort of, rattled the trust, in institutions, and sort of, one of the reasons why we have this, disjointed, fragmented, populist-laden society that we have now. Now, genre could be abstracted to three levels. The first one are the pre-genres or micro-genres. And these are, again, genres are social actions that are found in text. So, this talks about broad abstract categories, like for example, narrative, or are you arguing, or the description, or a conversation. So what the particular text is doing, no, at the minute level, micro genre, that is also very much broad abstract categories, which you can see across, larger genres. But also we have the disembedded genres and situated genres, no, that are both considered by Paltridge as macro genres, and these embedded genres are lifted from their original practice but are widely usable, like an interview or a report. So for example, a report, an interview could be something that be done in a journalistic sense. It can be done by, let's say, a lifestyle sense. It can be done by a content creator, a podcast, right? An interview is also done by a researcher, right? But while these are the genre sounds broad, no, it's an interview. It has like its rules and ways of engaging and its particular action, right? But when you put them from one context, the goal differs. Like a journalistic interview would be different from an ethnographic interview, would be different from a content creator's interview, would be different from a podcast interview, no. And then we have situated genres that are really very specific to a network of practice or a discourse community. Like, for example, an ethnographic interview is very specific for a researcher who does ethnography. Or when you say scientific report, now it specifies report into something that is within the science parlance. Or, for example, when you say press conference, no, when you say it's different from a showbiz press conference. So for example, no, this embedded genre is a press conference. If it's a political press conference, it now becomes a situated genre. If it's a showbiz press conference, no, it becomes now a situated genre. So when you put context on the disembedded genres and then there's a new goal to it, then that is called a situated genre. But both of them are both macro genres. As I explained before, we have genre mixing. Like, for example, a manager in an ethnographic interview, which is the main genre, might shift to a narrative, no? Or the story of the company, of the manager being interviewed by the researcher, or an argument. Like, within that same interview, nagkwento siya, also nag-defend siya ng kanyang management practices. And of course, as we mentioned, no, the prototypicality, we argue that genres have structures, no? And there are structures that are more fixed. Like, for example, you expect introduction methods, results, and discussion in a scientific paper, or call centers, no, have their scripts, no, of how they engage with clients, no? And then it can be like a flexible, like, for example, a lifestyle feature, a podcast is different. Like, you have, of course, the usual red pill podcast, no medyo they really use inflammatory language, and they really focus on topics, and they talk over people, etc. And they have these particular tones. And then you have a medical podcast that has a different spring to it. Or have a comedy podcast, right? So the podcast is generally flexible. The podcast that the only podcast that I do listen to, but I don't listen to anymore so much, right? Is a off book, right? So it's a podcast of two a male and a female singer and songwriter, and another person that they have a guest, and then they create a musical on the spot with a prompt. So it's like an impromptu an improv musical. So it's really nice. So that, again, that's a very flexible way of putting a podcast. Very flexible because it's improv. But there's also some fixity to it, right? Because it follows the usual theater, the musical theater. So they have they sort of already prompts of how to start it, the climax, and also the peaks and the throws of terms of the emotions and the dynamics of the story. They're also able to do it, no? But like I said, podcast, right? In general, it's a very flexible genre. And then genres, based on where they are produced, they involve social agents like individuals, groups, and organizations, right? So the genre could be from an individual person. So it can be a conversation, it can be an interview, it can be a report that you submit, a research that you but it can be for groups. Like a research can have multiple groups, a role play can be a group, a theater can be a group, right? And of course, organizations. An advertisement represents a brand and or an organization. The prospectus of a university represents an organization, etc. And so, social relationships in genres are therefore shaped by power and solidarity. So power meaning it tells you who holds authority or influence in the exchange, and also it tells you about solidarity, the degree of closeness or shared identity within the participants, right? So for example, in the idea of new capitalism in late modern societies, organizations hold massive power over individuals like corporations, governments, international bodies like IMF. But to avoid backlash, they use genres that simulate equality and closeness, like use friendly language, conversational tones, or inclusive we to make distant hierarchical relationship feel equal. Like here in name the telecommunications company here, right? We value your we value your family. We value your relationships. We understand that good connections are important. Consistent connections are important. So for example, sa political address in a SONA, mga kababayan, no? I mean, I'm talking over you, but I'm also telling you na I'm also sort of, engaging with you as if we're equals, pareho tayo ng kababayan, no? Like for example in a reality show, like for example in American Idol, or for example in Drag Race Snatch Game, no? Or in challenges in reality shows, it feels like, these people are in control, but in the end of the day, the one that calls the shots of the whole outcome is the producer. So we always say na parang, this particular person in this reality show is making it spicy, right? Making it interesting. But it's really, there's a hierarchy of the producers trying to make the story, quote unquote, blame it on the edit, right? Or for example, the relatability of the brand, that they really have to, it's something that we teach marketing and business people now. Your brand has to be relatable. Something like that. Or as a content creator, you have to be relatable. So it again, no, it gives the feeling of, parasociality, that I am in solidarity with my viewers, but in fact, I hold some power over you because, I hold some quote-unquote influence over you. Kaya nga influencer. Right? So, for example, public health campaigns nung COVID-19, right? Ingat po tayo. Alagaan po natin ang isa't isa. Let's take care of each other. Let's take care of ourselves. Right? But really, I'm imposing, right? Tayo po ay wag lumabas ng bahay para tayo po ay para sa ating mga kababayan, no? So it feels like it's a shared responsibility, which it really is, right? But when you look into the public it's really there's a power into it, right? You are forcing people to not be mobile. And then of course, yun nga, tulad ng sabi natin, no, new capitalism has put forth what we call the conversionalization of public discourse. And this is Fairclough's work, which is very much tied to Habermas' public sphere, wherein there's a rise of two-way mediated communication, like let's say phone calls, and then which happens social media. You have Vico Soto answering to comments of people directly, right? You have governors and public agencies interacting, whether that the person interacting is really so there's an increasing conversionalization aside as conversationalization, of public discourse, political discourse. We can talk to Wendy's, we can talk to Shell, we can talk to the brands, right? And they react to our posts, and then sobrang uplifted pa tayo pag nag-react sa atin yung ating mga brands, right? Things like that, right? So there's an increasing conversationalization of society that gives that illusion that there is an increasing solidarity between those who hold the technology, those who hold the genre in power, but in reality it's just a genre, it's just a social action deployed by the genre so that we could feel like, we have shared power, but in reality the one who created the text in original, who started the conversation, quote unquote, is really the one in power. And it's just masking it in this sort of conversational parlance. And then, when you look at, let's say, genres that are medyo high stakes, like for example, a political speech, an apology video, someone explaining a new policy, right? So, Tulmin, when we are trying to study these genres, we also have to look at, arguments according to Tulmin. And according to Tulmin, an argument, a genre with an argument consists of the following. We have the grounds, or the evidence, or the starting point; a warrant, the logic that connects the grounds to the conclusion; the claim, or the conclusion or point being argued; and the backing, additional support for the backup. So for example, the grounds, if this is your reason, the school lacks computers. The warrant is the link to your point. If we don't fix this, students can't learn well. The claim is your conclusion. We need to buy more computers. The backing, or extra proof, other schools that upgraded saw better results. So that's sort of how arguments are made, particularly in political speeches and debates. But in many real-world texts, these elements are not fully visible, right? Often the warrant or backing is assumed and not really backed by evidence. For example, a government might argue that economic reforms are necessary for growth. The grounds may be for poor economic indicators, and the claim is the need for reforms. But the warrant, the reforms that actually, like the warrant is that, okay, when we do reforms, it will automatically bring growth, maybe left unstated or assumed as common sense, or dumbed down into very simplistic statements where in fact economic growth is a very complex situation, and if not done properly, it might lead to more fragmentation in society, like more marginalized people becoming more marginalized, etc. and etc. So that's an example of how we can sort of piece apart these genres, like political speeches, debates, apology videos, right? How can we sort of uncover which one is assumed, which one really doesn't hold water? If it doesn't hold water, then that's where we attack it. That's where we put our resistance. Kung wala siyang ebidensya, then we put evidence. And I think that in terms of a lot of arguments, you go to a comment section of a troll-infested comment section, a troll-infested post, and you would see a lot of that, right? There would be really there's a ground, there's a ground and a claim, but the warrants are not there. Like for example, it would say we need more discipline, no? So for example, kulang sa disiplina mga Pilipino, so dapat madisiplina, and then it would be backed with what is ever happening in Singapore, right? But is it really it's as if that what they do in Singapore is, if we do that in the Philippines, it's really going to happen. But are there really evidences or empirical studies, or at least anecdotal reports that could, But again, at the anecdotal reports, I wouldn't really take them, right? I would take more synthesized, high level evidence, before you say that this is something that I can predict or forecast could be improving my life. Otherwise, no. Right? So that's how we kind of tear apart you know. And again, this is the reason also why you know, sometimes for corrupt governments, they don't invest much in education, because when people become more evidence based in their decisions, people are going to find evidence, you know, warrants and backings in the grounds and the claims of the programs of their leaders, and they can start to question, they can start to resist. And so that's the reason why corrupt governments may not invest a lot on education, because they don't want an enlightened society. And so it is in the development of the arguments, you know, where we can see assumptions and ideologies. So arguments often rest on assumptions tied to dominant discourses. Alam mo naman tayong mga Pilipino, tayo ay makapamilya. And so we have to do everything to protect our family. So no to divorce, something to that effect, right? So dominant discourses, no? By presenting these assumptions as unquestionable, texts do not do ideological work, turning contested ideas into natural truths about, you know, marriage is a sanctimonious phenomenon, which is, you know, true naman. But again, it is more complex than that specific ideology that you just put into it. It's not a universal thing. This is why CDA analyzes not just explicit statements, but also the implicit assumptions behind those arguments. So we really have to think, you know, about, you know, the ways that if the possible effects that this could be deployed, this text could deploy, and also the possible antecedents, assumptions, ideologies that back them up, right? So that we can really further tease out where they're coming from. So one microgenre or pre-genre is argument. The second one is narrative. So narratives are telling stories, right? So narratives have different types. It can be a fabula. It can be a raw sequence of events, right? So ano talaga yung nangyari, no? And then a story is with characters, a sequence, and a point of view. Sometimes, right, something happens and it just happens without a point of view. Like, for example, may nagkabanggaan. But from a particular vantage point, when it becomes storyfied by a person or a particular perspective, suddenly there are characters. And their characters have protagonist and antagonist. And of course, from one perspective, yung isang protagonist, yung isang antagonist. We've seen that in the flood control projects, right? About how positioning how positioning characters in the story and their motives, you know, sort of tell us different messages, no? But like, simple na lang, no? Nagkabanggaan. From the vantage point of one driver, siya ang may kasalanan. From the vantage point of one, ako ang protagonist, ikaw ang antagonist sa storya na ito. From someone watching, pareho kayong hindi masyadong okay sa pagdadrive, right? Or a police officer coming to the scene, right? So, the fabula, like, it is what nagkabanggaan, period, right? From the vantage point of God, probably, right? But stories now, when these raw events become storyfied, then we have characters, we have a plot. There is, because, you know, humans will sort of have that inclination to have resolution, no? To start something, to have a climax and then resolve, right? Which is then through a narrative text in media, film, or writing, which also frames the story in a particular way. And so the one is, so it's storyfied and then framed, right? So the medium is the message, right? And so, mas na-amplify anong parts ng story ang important, no? So for example, in media or in news, then we only just, you know, magsimula ka patay agad. You know, when we report murders in media, in news media, 30 katao patay, 'di ba? Pero like, but the story, when it becomes some MMK story, masisimula yan sa kabataan nung biktima or nung pamilya nung biktima, and then climax yung pagkamatay. But in a news report, matay, doon magsisimula, and then going back to whatever happened. So, again, no? So, it becomes a narrative text when it's already framed by the medium or the social agents that is using that particular story and publishing that into a narrative text. And like I said, argumentation and narratives are not neutral, right? And they show social regulation, they show assumptions, they show ideologies, no, that are very much linked to the social structures in our society. And so how do we now do genre analysis in a more discourse analysis type, no? And then probably we can go for more critical, but generally in the context of Paltridge, no? So we can either do text first, like for example, we look at, the arrangement of the text, the structure first, or we can look at the context of the genre, who uses them, where is it used, and why is it particularly used, and when is it used, right? So how do we collect genre? So for example, first we collect samples, like with a small exploratory set, like one typical for a deep dive, or a large set of patterns, like let's say Twitter threads from a particular political group or an activist group. No, so what could be? So you're going to get a lot of instructions for that, right? So you're going to let a lot of samples for that and see what is common, and then map what's known. So are there any prior research about that genre? What are there settings? Are there conventions? Are there guidebooks? For example, it's right. Say you wanna study about call center genres, right? So are there already guidebook books available or prior research that has been done? And you can look into that. And then you define roles. Who is the speaker or the writer, the audience, and the relationships among them. As we discussed in the session, texts are able to reflect that, no, or to imply who is the audience and who is the speaker. And then we clarify what are the immediate and higher order aims of the genre. So for example, let's say an apology video. So syempre, the immediate is to, say sorry, to address the allegations. But the higher order aims probably would be to save, the personal brand, right? So something to that effect. So what are the particular purposes of a particular genre? Next, we describe discourse patterns, like how is it staged, how is it laid out, recurrent lexis and grammars. What are and probably the grammatical mood and the text, that we will discuss that later, how the clauses are arranged, right? What are the words that are frequently said? What are the metaphors usually used, right? Is it monological, is it dialogical, etc. And then we surface assumption and value. So this is where it becomes more critical. So what knowledge, ideologies, and worldviews are being presupposed, in that particular genre. And then locate genre networks. What are the other genres? Kasi remember, genres work in chains. So where do they? So what are the sets, the repertoires around the target genres? So for example, again, a Twitter thread, of a political activist groups, then probably it's tied to, let's say, an interview that has been done, with the representatives of that group. It could be tied to a soundbite of a politician that they're trying to address, right? It can be tied to the comments of that particular Twitter thread. It can be tied to that thread being screenshot and then being responded to in a different platform. So you get to see sort of the system and the entangled genres, where in your particular genre is looking to. So probably at this moment you already have sort of an idea of what you want to study. But of course, like I mentioned, since we're doing critical discourse analysis, we have to look at those genre that wherein we are able to expose power and knowledge inequities, right? We look at hierarchy, we look at power being dressed up in, fake not really fake, but, assumed solidarity, right? Who sets the rules of the genre, whose voices count, and which assumptions get neutralized, and what is the nature of the person for that genre to work. Like I said, right, when you do business letters, it's different when you are, let's say, when you, for example, in the context of a grievance post about, let's say, a bad a grievance post, let's say, of a bad service from, let's say, from a water company or an electricity company or an internet company, right? Every day you see Twitter being blood. You search for, let's say, a particular telecommunications company, you would see a lot of, normal people writing their grievances. Pero when it's Carla Abellana, these telecommunication companies eventually work. So sometimes genres can be used by a lot of people, but sometimes they work differently across different personas based on the power that you usually have. So those are the things that we also analyze in terms of doing genre analysis. So these are the topics that we covered for today. You can screenshot this and you try to remember if you remember the meanings of all of these things. No, if not, then you can scroll back, or scrub back to the part of the presentation wherein this was explained. And I'll see you in our next video.